Let me introduce our speaker for today, Katrina Dean, who comes from Tasmania, so she's come a long way to talk to us all today. It's taken her 10 years to get here, the last 5 of which she has spent as Curator for History of Science at the British Library, which strikes me as an absolutely gorgeous job to have. However, it's not all that gorgeous because you found a better one, and in 3 months' time Katrina will be going off to be the archivist at Melbourne University, so that's sort of most of the way home, but not quite all.
Not quite all the way.
So is this your last public appearance in London?
No, in 2 weeks' time at the National Maritime Museum.
So this is almost your last chance to catch Katrina,
Yes.
and if you want a second helping, then you have a chance in 2 weeks' time. Meanwhile, we have a talk on John Maynard Smith, who is a much-loved fellow of the Royal Society and highly respected within the Society in a way that few fellows are. So to an extent, I should say, that few fellows are. We look forward very much to learning more about him and about his archive. Katrina.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time out. Thank you for coming along today. So today I'm going to just give you a very straightforward talk about the archive of John Maynard Smith, how it came to the British Library, what we're doing to curate it, and what kind of historical questions might be able to be explored using this archive. And of course I'll give you a little bit of background about John Maynard Smith and his work as well. But I'll just preface it with some sort of reflections on issues around information that I've been thinking about for a time in relation to the history of science more generally. So in the history of biology, the information metaphor is one of the most contested and pervasive metaphors, really. And it's helped and it's hindered many biologists think about issues of transmission, communicate with the public, and connect with other disciplines. Analogies have spread to other sciences, as in the Ice Core archive here in the Earth Sciences, and the metaphor has returned to be adopted rather uncritically by the information profession. When I first saw this news story, I thought it was actually a story about the archiving of some kind of digital genomic information, but in fact it is the storage of digital preservation technology to preserve information in the future. It doesn't actually have anything to do with genomic information or biology at all. They're just using the metaphor of the genome as information. So it's sort of going around in a circle, a metaphor that started out in one area, has been applied to biology, and now it's coming back into the information profession. And some of you have read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, will be familiar with the idea of the meme and the transmission of culture, and that's just another example of that. So while these are kind of separate issues, I think by analogy, it's quite useful to think about the history of biology in terms of its information heritage, and it's quite a familiar approach for which there are many precedents. Notable in this are the large distributed archives of 19th century evolution, including the papers of Darwin, Wallace, Bateson and others, of which the British Library holds a number of items, but also in many other archives. The primary Darwin archive is at Cambridge University Library, for example. But today I'm going to talk about the lesser-known archives of post-World War II evolutionary science, and in particular the archive of John Maynard Smith, 1920 to 2004. That's his date. I will suggest some ways in which these new sources might contribute to the history of evolution and to the history of 20th century science. I think we can think about the study of the history of evolution in terms of quite different informational models. We can think about it in terms of tree-like or ancestral models, vertical models, that look back to the precursors of current evolutionary ideas. Or alternatively, we can look at it in terms of a network model that traces the horizontal relationships to contemporary developments in the history of science. So while studies of 19th century evolution have explored their ancestors, they've tended to emphasize the discontinuity of Darwinian evolution as a new theory. Historians have studied the wider networks of 19th century correspondence and natural history to explain the major developments in 19th century evolutionary thinking. But by way of contrast, perhaps, the historiography of the 20th century evolution has emphasized connections to Darwin and/or to other ancestors like Lamarck. And even within the so-called neo-Darwinian camp, of modern evolutionary science, particular ancestral lines can be traced. For example, John Maynard Smith to John Burdon Sanderson Haldane, or William Donald Hamilton to Ronald Fisher. And indeed, evolutionary scientists have tended to think and to write about the history of their own disciplines in this way, as genealogists of ideas. And to put 2009 celebrations of Darwin in context, there is plenty of previous Darwin commemoration material in the John Maynard Smith archive. In the 1980s, there was a big commemoration, and there's lots of activity by John Maynard Smith and others around that commemoration, thinking about their own work in relation to the history of the discipline. And that's a very interesting part of the archive. So in this sense, contemporary evolutionary scientists can be seen as basically filling out the pieces of a puzzle that was set by their intellectual ancestors through a series of empirical and refined theoretical tools. So I think this approach has been explored in popular science, in philosophy and sociology. And some examples of some of the work in this field are Andrew Brown's book on the Darwin Wars. There's a book by Ulrika Segerstrahl called Defenders of the Truth, which is about the sociobiology debate in the 1970s and 80s. And there's a few examples around. So it seems possible, if we look into the archive, however, that we might be able to write some new directions in the history of evolutionary science using some new sources. Giving some examples, some of the richer studies of 19th century evolutionary science have explored the relationship of intellectual with social and political developments, not just for the political implications of evolution, so social Darwinism, for example, but also as forms of historical explanation of the development of Darwin's theory itself. So I guess my aim today is simply to suggest how the emerging evolutionary archive might support the study of intellectual developments in evolutionary thinking alongside the study of evolution as part of the wider networks of 20th century science and society. So that's the preface. But what we really want to know is who was John Maynard Smith and what's in his archive. So John Maynard Smith was the son of a banker. His father died in 1928 and he lived in Berkshire, spending summers in Devon with his paternal grandparents and exploring natural history. He went to Eton, which he disliked very much until around the age of 16, when he discovered Darwinism, communism, and the work of J.B.S. Haldane. He studied maths and engineering at Cambridge, and he worked as an aeronautical engineer in World War II, working on problems of stress in aircraft. But after the war, he decided to change disciplines, and he studied zoology at University College London with Haldane. And he started a PhD in fruit fly genetics, working on the classical organism of population genetics. And he formed a lifelong connection with Haldane. And there's quite a lot of scientific and personal material relating to Haldane in the archive. There's some commemorative material around the time that Haldane went to India, some poems. John Maynard Smith is a contributor, but also there's some correspondence, mainly to do with events in the later part of Haldane's life, around his settling of his affairs after he'd gone to India. Maynard Smith had an engineer's ability to use numbers to model systems, and most of his work was in the field of population biology. He joined the Communist Party when a teenager, but he left in 1956. In 1965, he was appointed the Professor of Biology and the founding Dean of the New School of Biology at the University of Sussex. And at a time of reform of departments of biology across the UK, aiming to facilitate a liberal education and interdisciplinary studies. Intellectually, Maynard Smith was known, or is known, as a neo-Darwinist, one who studied the evolution of adaptation through natural selection, and who tried to apply this approach to different problems and environments. And many of his intellectual concerns address traditional unsolved problems, such as the evolution of sex, which can be traced to ancestral concerns in the history of evolution. But his main innovation was, however, in the application of game theory to the evolution of animal behaviour. And he's well known for this paper with another figure called George Price. George Price was a really interesting character who had started out in computing, had worked for IBM, had tried to write some popular books on Cold War strategy in the US, and migrated to the UK and just started working on evolutionary problems using mathematical techniques. So he was a bit of an outsider to this field, but he managed to submit a paper to Nature, which came by John Maynard Smith as a reviewer, and they began work together And this became the sort of famous Atlas Papers of 1973, in which he first started to develop the idea of the evolutionary stable strategy. Maynard Smith also studied topics like the evolution of language and later in his career molecular evolution and variation as applied to the case of bovine tuberculosis, for example. And what's interesting about this archive is actually, unlike most 20th century scientist archives, there's very, very little committee papers, sitting on scientific committees, advising government, all that sort of thing. There's very little of that in this material, and I suspect that's partly because that wasn't an activity John Maynard Smith was heavily involved in, but he was involved in this particular study in veterinary science. And I think it might be quite fruitful to consider how some of these studies related to wider networks in the social and biological sciences. So, for example, whilst Maynard Smith isn't a laboratory scientist, and he's not a field scientist either, he has lots of connections to people who are working in laboratories on molecular problems, people who are working in the fields in ethology and observation of animal behaviour and so on. So at Sussex, Maynard Smith was part of the population studies group. And again, very dissimilar to many scientists that we know quite well in post-war history. He didn't build a research school, so it wasn't that he had lots of students and they all worked on problems that he defined or anything like that. But on the other hand, as is totally clear from the archive, he wasn't a lone thinker by any means. And his group hosted lots of visitors. And you can sort of see, I think, between 1979 and 82, there's 100 letters of people wanting to come and visit his group. So he has a lot of international visitors coming and going, having lots of conversations in fairly informal contexts, attends a lot of conferences, speaks to doctoral students and postdoctoral researchers at those conferences. So a lot of the interaction is very informal rather than through specific training in a research school. And that's quite unusual at this time, really. He was definitely a convivial person who was renowned at conferences and had a huge correspondence network. And there are I think there's more than 600 letters in the archive from scientists all around the world, and also a lot of John Maynard Smith outgoing correspondence, so he actually copied his replies and kept those with his archive as well. The correspondence is of a kind, again, that's rarely seen in a contemporary archive. It has detailed discussion and workings out of scientific arguments, including reasoning and equations. So this letter to Dick Lewontin is around the time probably of the reviews that John Maynard Smith did of E.O. Wilson's book, Sociobiology, and other publications that came out following that, or possibly the review of Dean's Mind and Culture, which was a later book. And he gets engaged in very, very detailed discussions with people about the content of the books, what are the arguments they're making, does that hold up, to the extent that he will go and rerun calculations, he will develop little computer models to test what they're exploring and so on. And here's an example on the right of the handwritten notes. So you can see he's actually going into quite a lot of detail about, what are they thinking, how does the reasoning work, how could one mathematise that, and so on. And I think this on the left is actually a letter from Wilson talking about that. So, the whole sociobiology debate, and Maynard Smith's role in that is quite interesting as well. It's basically a debate in the 1970s and 80s about whether or not it's appropriate to apply the methodologies and findings of animal studies in animal behaviour to human society, and whether that's fruitful or beneficial in any way, whether it is scientifically plausible. And it became very entrenched with different political stances. It came following the debate around intelligence testing in the 1970s, the work of Arthur Jensen. And it involved people in the US, it involved biologists in the UK, including people like Stephen Rose and John Maynard Smith. So it was a very big event, in terms of looking at science and society in this period. And John Maynard Smith's way of dealing with this was very, very scientific. So he got very engaged in the detailed arguments that people were making, rather than trying to get involved in posing with regard to particular political views or particular ideological views. He wanted to get down to, what are the arguments, how do they work scientifically? And for that reason, he spent quite a long time doing these reviews of the books that came out. And he went through all the maths, and he sort of said that he felt that he was one of the one of the people who could engage with the mass, and so he felt a responsibility to do it, and he read through all of that work. So his work was collaborative, it was international, and it was on paper. And in a sense, the archive has an even more important role in understanding his work. And to this extent, it doesn't really correspond to the history of post-war science as we know it, with its emphasis on laboratories, on facilities, and on big science. However, we can pick up some other themes of 20th century science later. But John Maynard Smith was a gardener and a chess player, which is kind of two interesting connections with traditional natural history on the one hand, and he has quite a lot of plant lists and observations in his archive, as well as a chess player. And there's this notebook of chess book notes and chess moves that he's recording. And he actually played chess with Donald Mickey, who was an artificial intelligence scientist, contemporary of his, also in the Communist Party for a long time. And they actually had chess matches together, and so he's sort of recording the moves that he's making and so on. So this seems a good place to talk about what's in the archive. But first, a little bit about its provenance, or, where did it come from, how did it come to the British Library? So it was donated to the British Library by John Maynard Smith in 2004, and it followed the deposit of another large evolutionary archive, that of William Donald Hamilton, following the latter's untimely death in 2004 in 2000, I think, on a trip to the Amazon. And the biologist, John Ashworth, was then the chair of the British Library Board, and so basically that's a connection there. And that's how these two large collections came to the British Library, and they sort of provided a bit of impetus for collecting some of the post-war archives of science at the British Library. So the archive was transported directly from John Maynard Smith's office at Sussex University in what is now the Maynard Smith building. And unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of the collection before it was moved, but I think if we were collecting this archive today, we would want to sort of document it in its context a bit more. So the archive, for that reason, mainly documents Maynard Smith's time at Sussex University, although there's a smaller amount of scientific material, largely off-prints dating back to 1948. It covers all of his major research and public activities. He was quite involved in public debates around creationism and often got asked to speak at public debates at the Oxford Union and so on, but also was a public broadcaster, mainly on the radio, and was very involved with the talks division and would often get asked to give sort of, the scientist perspective on science and religion or philosophical questions. So he was actually seen as a scientist who would be able to explain some scientific ideas to the public in a sort of public media context. I think in early 1950s he wrote a Penguin, sort of more of a popular book on evolutionary theory as well, and that sort of started to establish his reputation in that area. He was also, there's a kind of peculiar file in the archive which is basically on the topic of gay evolution, and this is kind of interesting because it shows how Maynard Smith would deal with inquiries from non-scientific members of the public. And there's a really kind of interesting interaction around lay and scientific interaction there. And the way that Maynard Smith deals with this is, rather than seeing it as a sort of crank letter or whatever, he actually tries to engage scientifically with the content of the argument. And there's a bit of correspondence and so on about scientific problems of the evolution of sex. And Maynard Smith does give it serious consideration. But in the end, given that his interlocutor isn't a scientist and there isn't really any kind of common language to have a discussion about this, I think Maynard Smith basically takes what is a liberal position in the relationship between science and society. And he basically says, as Richard Dawkins does, that although science may say that nature is in a certain way, that in no way constrains how humans should behave or organise themselves socially. So it's kind of a separation of the two things. While there may be biological reasons that humans are in such and such a way, on the other hand, that we're also made to think and to socialise and to be creative, and and to make our own decisions about how we want to organise society. So he kind of made a separation between those two things, which I think is kind of interesting given his political background. It's very different from the science and society position of people like Bernal and Haldane even, and I think that would be very interesting to try and track some of those changes in the relationship between science and politics, say from the 1940s to the 1960s. So the other thing, I guess, that's interesting about this archive is while people are very happy to categorise Maynard Smith as a neo-Darwinist and to have had a particular position about, how evolution happens, in fact, the archive documents a much, much wider variety of approaches in evolutionary science. So there's a whole file, again, about the sociobiology positions, which are quite different, studies of animal behaviour. There's a whole file on the work of Marion Lamb and Eva Jablonka on the inheritance of acquired variation, effectively looking into more of a Lamarck's position and so on. So in fact, he does actually seriously engage with a whole range of different perspectives in science, not just his own particular position. I think that's important to remember, and that's what makes the archive rather interesting. Yes, and again, this is some of the computer printouts and so on in his file in relation to the review of Genes, Mind and Culture that he did in the 1980s. Again, he must have spent a huge amount of time reviewing this book and had sort of written his own computer programs and so on. So what's missing from the archive? That's also an interesting question to ask, not just what's there, but what's missing. As I said before, there are no committee papers, and there's little concerning his early life or politics. And I think these are two absences which kind of reinforce one another. If we consider that his most active political life was early in his career, before he moved to Sussex, so much of that material is just lost, or perhaps, I don't know, perhaps other people have it, perhaps it remains with the family, but I haven't been able to track any of that material down, if it does exist. So what we have is very much his, established scientific professional career from the 1960s at Sussex. And this is not unique to the JMS archive, and it's something I've noticed in other contemporary archives at the British Library in particular. And I think it may have something to do with what we consider as interesting in scientists' lives, that the only thing that's interesting about scientists is their science, and that's perhaps the perspective they have on themselves as well. Whereas I think, from a historical point of view, we're actually interested in their whole biography. We're interested in their personal background, we're interested in their education, what other cultural influences there were on them, and I think that would be quite an important message to get across if you were advising scientists about what kind of material to keep for the future. And it actually has quite a big effect on the way that scientists are perceived. On the death of Anne McLaren, who was a Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, and her ex-husband Donald Mickey, there's an interesting correspondence in the newspaper from members of her family saying it's all very interesting, all the obituaries and so on that have been written about the wonderful scientific contributions that these people have made, but these are actually two individuals who have had a very strong commitment to social justice and a social agenda over a long period of years, and there's actually been very little written about that. And I thought that was an interesting perspective from a family member, and a family which itself is in many different ways still quite committed to issues of social interest as well. So I think that sort of covered what's not in the archive. The archive how is it arranged? Well, it's largely arranged in the original order that it came to when we got it from Sussex. And the main categories are publications by JMS. Then there are some correspondence files that cover some pretty routine day-to-day correspondence, like testimonials. And there are some kind of pretty hilarious testimonials in there for people in my own field, in this history of science and technology studies. John Maynard Smith was obviously the scientist that people rang up when they weren't really sure how to understand what historians of science were doing and say, could you give us a perspective on this fellow? There's a lot of review material in there, and there's a lot of review of Penrose's work, for example, Roger Penrose's work on the Emperor's New Mind and other things. So he's very much part of that review culture. There's lots of information about visits. There are referees' reports for other scientists. Lots of correspondence with publishers, and of course he published several books. Lots of stuff about his conference arrangements and so on. And this is kind of another interesting perspective. This is a review for a contribution of Maynard Smith to a book by Lynn Margulies, and I think it's Ronald Fester. Again, people who Lynn Margulies is known for her work with James Lovelock in looking at the evolution of organisms in response to their environment, but also of the environment in response to organisms, which was a very controversial position relative to that of John Maynard Smith and his colleagues. And again, he's engaging with that through a publication. The most important part of the archive are actually subject files, and these are the main part of the archive. They document John Maynard Smith's own work, so they've got off-prints, drafts, handwritten notes showing his bibliographic style, equations, his reasoning, and they've got detailed and substantial correspondence. And these files are basically arranged by subject using his own titles, so you can see how he classified his own work. So that could be quite good for historians, I think, who don't want to feel like they're sort of, the original context has been written over by an archivist later. I mean, it pretty much is organised as Maynard Smith organised it himself. And computer printouts will show the importance of the personal computer to a scientist's work as well. This is not at all computing that's done on a big supercomputer in a big facility. This is just stuff that he's running little programs modelling on his personal computer. And these are just some examples of the little handwritten notes that he would do when he's working on a problem, trying to reason it out. This file is actually on his studies of Mycobacterium, so the tuberculosis question again. There's also a small amount of lecture notes, and that's an example of the slides and so on that he was giving at his lectures. There are some notebooks, and I think this one is really lovely. It's a book of expenses of monies received for services rendered, basically. All the talks and public lectures and so on that he was giving, and this is not his handwriting, so I wonder if it is possibly his wife who is keeping these accounts and keeping this notebook of, where the fees are coming from and so forth. There are off-prints that show the work of other people again, that lots of people are sending papers to John Maynard Smith, they're seeking advice, and it just shows how seriously he engaged with this wider literature in evolutionary science. And there's lots of annotations and lots of letters and notes around other people's work as well. I guess another interesting aspect of this archive are the born digital, so-called, electronic manuscripts or digital files, however you want to call them. And there were 2 hard drives and approximately 100 floppy disks that came with Maynard Smith Archive. There don't appear to be many files on the hard drive, but there are a few, and there are some drafts of his book with David Harper on animal signals. And you can see on the right there, this is the kind of draft, and this is our little cataloguing system that we've got on the left there. So we're just trying to catalogue those and bring those into the system as well, so researchers can use them. Again, there's this sort of interesting thing with modern archives where you have some versions of one piece of work, which might be a digital file, and the next one is a printout, and then it's back to the digital file again. So the kind of study of trying to link all those different versions together, if you're interested in how a manuscript changes over time or something, will be quite a lot of work for researchers. But you can sort of see there were several versions of some of these chapters within that hard drive, and I was able to tell which was the earlier one, and just by looking at the publication basically, and who contributed what. The other interesting thing that my colleague Jeremy John, who's the curator of e-manuscripts at the library, has experimented with is to basically emulate the hard drive and how it looked, how John Maynard Smith's hard drive looked. So what we would really like to do is not just kind of show you a file and a catalogue record, but wouldn't it be nice if you could just sit down and pretend that you're John Maynard Smith for the day and boot up his computer and see, okay, well, this is how he had his files, this is where they were. And it's technically possible. There are just all sorts of kind of logistical issues and I guess not least data protection issues around doing that. But this is what his hard drive would look like when he booted it up, basically. This is what we've run from his hard drive. You can see it's sort of that slightly 1980s typeface and so on, different versions of Windows. And then, you can just go through and open some of the documents there. And this is some of the Haldane Memorial kind of literature. Yeah. So I guess I just sort of want to finish, really, fairly briefly, with what we're doing in terms of archival projects to make this archive available. A draft catalogue is available now, and that's not showing up very well, is it? Oh yes, you can see it there. If you go to this link, the top link there, searcharchives.bl.uk, and you type in Maynard Smith, you will be able to go to the catalogue, and you'll be able to search the whole catalogue for yourself, really. And it's got quite a lot of background information about his career and things he was working on there as well. The other thing that I kind of have struggled with some of these contemporary archives is they often come with a lot of off-prints and publications. Now, obviously, as the British Library and many other libraries as well, we hold many of these publications in duplicate, triplicate, we're subscribers to these journals. And so the question is, if they come in as part of a sciences archive, do you really want to keep them, or, is it just duplicating? But of course, the great thing about an off-print collection is it shows you everything they were reading. It shows you who's writing to them, there's annotations, all those kinds of things. So it's quite labour-intensive, but I do think it is worth trying to bibliography those collections, even if you're not going to keep them, because then at least you can sort of see what was in the collection, what was being read. And I think that would be quite a good resource for a historian to then just go back to, rather than having to reconstitute that bibliography later on. So we've done about 600 of the off-prints in the collection, but there are many, many more. I'd say that's probably only a quarter of what there are. Correspondence. It would be great to do a calendar of the correspondence and perhaps to publish some of the correspondence online. And one of the main risks around this, obviously, is third-party rights in correspondence. And I don't know how many of you professional archivists or what the audience constitutes, but really, when you write a letter to someone, you're passing ownership to them, but you're not passing your copyright in the content of the letter that you've written. So often, many archives actually contain mostly letters from other people, of which you do not own the copyright. Neither John Maynard Smith nor the British Library own the copyright. So there's a kind of risk that if you put all this information online, which is effectively publishing it, copyright is retained by others. But actually, I think that's less daunting than it might be, because I know that some scientists, students, colleagues of John Maynard Smith are actually publishing the correspondences from him online already, and I've found examples of that on the web where they've published their correspondence. And so perhaps putting it up and having a takedown policy, if people objected, would not be actually so risky, especially where most of this correspondence is of a scientific nature. It's not personal correspondence. And then obviously you would need to examine it quite carefully to protect any private or personal information. So, of course, there's also the other archives. We hold a very small amount of manuscripts and letters of George Price at the British Library as well, which came to us, and they complement this archive very nicely. And there's also a much larger archive of Hamilton, which is held at the library on loan as well, and that's together those three really make up quite an amazing resource, and there's still a lot of work to be done, especially on the Hamilton archive. There's a small amount of audiovisual material that's come into the Maynard Smith archive, but this needs to be examined for rights, etc. And I think it's interesting, one of the other projects I'm involved in at the moment is an oral history of British science, where we're looking at interviewing a number of living scientists in particular themed areas. And I thought it would have been really interesting to have been able to interview John Maynard Smith in this way. These are very long interviews. They're covering someone's whole life story, their family background, their education, their early career, politics, religion, morality, beliefs, as well as their scientific work. And I think that would have made a great complement to this archive, given what is missing from the archive. And so it's kind of interesting to think about how those two sources might work together. And if you want to find out more about the Oral History Project, there's a link there. Actually, the easiest way to get to that is just to go www.bl.uk/history of science, and then that will take you to the Oral History Project page, and you can get to the blog that way. So I just really invite you to discuss any of these projects and ways of taking them forward. So in conclusion then, the John Maynard Smith Archive and others in the field are becoming available for the study of evolution and 20th century science. And the archive sort of reminds us that evolutionary science is a family of disciplines, really, with analogies to the earth sciences converging around particular theories and paradigms. And there are strong connections with the development of other sciences and specific influences to and from the social sciences and engineering, for example, as well as the wider politics of science and society. And all of these remain to be traced, I would argue. The material that's becoming available to study the post-war history of evolution in the context of 20th century science may enable some fairly rich forms of historical explanation, just as that kind of explanation is available to the 19th century historians of science. What I'm arguing is basically these kinds of archives will make that kind of rich historical explanation available for the 20th century as well. And I think there's a possibility of exploring new sources through digital collections and through oral history. And that's it.
Thank you very much.